I want to bring you back to an age so ancient that even the oldest songs barely whisper its name, an age when Middle-earth was still young and every breath of wind carried the weight of destiny. As I speak to you now, I can almost feel the pulse of that forgotten world beneath my feet. For it was there that the story of the rings began subtly, deliberately, and with a brilliance that dazzled even the wisest of beings. In those days, the elves sought knowledge and beauty with a fervor unmatched. The dwarves shaped the bones of the earth with unmatched craftsmanship, and men, ever restless, reached for glory they could scarcely define. All three peoples believed they were the masters of their own fate. They did not yet know that a shadow walked among them, patient and cunning. That shadow was Sauron, though he did not reveal his true form or intention. He approached the elven smiths with honeyed words and promises of wisdom so deep it could illuminate the very fabric of creation. To them, he appeared noble, gifted, eager to uplift the world, and they, brilliant yet tragically trusting, welcomed his guidance. Under his influence, the forged fires of Eregion roared like the heartbeat of a newborn empire. Together, Sauron and the smiths crafted rings of immense power. 3 for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, 9 for men. Each ring carried splendor, mastery, and a strange allure, as though the metal itself hummed with secret potential. But I want you to understand something crucial. Sauron never intended these rings to be gifts. They were bait glittering chains meant to bind the free peoples to his will. While the others worked in open flame and honest craft, Sauron retreated to the fires of Mount Doom, where he poured malice and domination into a masterpiece unlike any other. That one ring, the Ring of Power, held not just strength but sovereignty, a cruel hook that would sink into the hearts of all who wore the lesser rings. Through it, Sauron sought to weave a net of obedience, stretching across Middle-earth, subtle at first and tightening slowly, unbearably, until no one could resist. When the elves discovered his betrayal, they reacted with fury and wisdom. They hid their 3 rings and refused to use them, denying Sauron the control he craved. This defiance ignited a war so vast that even centuries later, its echoes tremble through the ruins of forgotten kingdoms. Armies marched, alliances fractured and reformed, and the land itself groaned beneath the weight of conflict. Sauron, now revealed in his terrible majesty, unleashed his forces with the certainty of one destined to conquer. Yet the free peoples did not kneel. The elves and men forged a last alliance, one final stand against the darkness rising from Mordor. I tell you this because I want you to feel the tension of that era, to sense the desperation and courage interwoven in every sword raised beneath those blackened skies. At the foot of Mount Doom, where the air itself stung with ash, the armies clashed. Elven blades sang with light, men held their lines with grim resolve, and for a time the balance wavered. But Sauron stepped into battle wielding the One Ring, and his presence alone bent hope toward despair. Warriors fell before him like wheat under a scythe. Yet even the mightiest tyrant can be wounded by the smallest opening, and such an opening came at a cost soaked in blood. Elendil, High King of Men, faced Sauron, and was struck down in a single brutal blow, his great sword shattered beneath him. But his son, Isildur, seized the broken hilt, and in a moment that would shape the fate of ages, cut the ring from Sauron's hand. Light and shadow erupted as the Dark Lord's form collapsed, stripped of the power that anchored him. Yet here's the tragedy I need you to see. Isildur stood at the edge of victory, holding the one object that could end evil forever, and he hesitated. The ring whispered to him, promising legacy, authority, the fulfillment of every unspoken desire, and he listened. Instead of casting the ring into the fire, he claimed it. In that instant, the triumph of the alliance soured into a quiet, festering doom. For though Sauron's body perished, his will endured, bound inseparably to the ring. Isildur did not wear it long. Ambushed near the river, he attempted to escape by slipping the ring onto his finger, trusting its power to hide him. But the ring betrayed him. It slid from his hand, abandoning him to arrows that ended his life. The One Ring then sank into the depths of the river, lost to time, waiting with a patience only darkness can possess. And so, my friend, that is how the Age of the Rings began, not with triumph but with temptation, not with unity but with a fracture that would widen across generations. Even now, as I recount this tale directly to you, I feel the weight of that choice echoing through every age that followed. The ring, though silent, shaped destinies simply by existing, a reminder that the smallest act of weakness can unleash centuries of shadow. Yet its disappearance did not erase its influence. It only allowed the world to forget, to grow complacent, to believe that evil had truly been vanquished. But you and I know better. The fall of Sauron was only the beginning, and the ring's quiet slumber was merely the pause before the storm. Let me guide you now into the long, quiet centuries that followed the fall of Sauron, for I want you to understand how cunning the ring truly is. After it slipped from Isildur's hand and drifted into the cold embrace of the Anduin, the world assumed the threat had passed. Kingdoms rose and crumbled, forests deepened, and mountains shifted their shapes. Yet beneath all of that change, the ring lay hidden, waiting with a patience only malice can sustain. No wind carried its whisper, no creature felt its pulse, and still its presence pressed faintly upon the world, like a memory the earth itself could not forget. I tell you this because the ring never rests. It watches, it lingers, and in time, it chooses. Many lifetimes later, two small figures wandered along the riverbank, Smeagol and his cousin Diagol, neither suspecting that the day would twist one life into tragedy and the other into a quiet grave. When Diagol spotted the ring gleaming in the river's depths and held it up as though some forgotten treasure had chosen him, I imagine the world itself shivered. Smeagol did not see a simple trinket. He saw desire raw, irresistible, whispered directly into his heart. In that moment, the ring awakened, and what followed was an act so sudden and shocking that it changed Smeagol forever. His hands tightened around Diagol's throat, and with that unforgivable act, he claimed the ring as his birthday gift. Even now, as I recount this to you, I feel the coldness of that moment ripple through me. The ring did not simply corrupt him, it hollowed him out. Smeagol retreated from sunlight, from laughter, from every fragment of the world that once held meaning. He crept into caverns beneath the misty mountains, whispering to the ring as though it were a companion and captor all at once. In the dark, he changed, shedding his name and becoming Gollum, a creature shaped more by longing than flesh. And still, the ring endured, clinging to him for generations, stretching his life unnaturally, twisting time around him like a noose. Yet the ring grew weary of him. It sought a new bearer, someone it could mold more directly, someone whose choices would ripple across the age. And so, in a moment of chance that was anything but accidental, it slipped from Gollum's finger and was found by a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo, unlike Gollum, carried no malice in his heart when he lifted the ring from the cavern floor. He only saw an odd little thing that might help him survive the dangers of his unexpected adventure. I want you to picture him. Small, curious, brave in ways he did not yet understand. For many years, he kept the ring tucked away as a useful trick, a secret companion that allowed him to vanish when trouble closed in. And the ring, sly as ever, bided its time. It stroked his mind gently, never revealing the depth of its power, but ensuring he would never willingly part with it. You must realize that the ring is subtle when it chooses to be. It does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. When Bilbo returned to the Shire, the ring returned with him, hidden inside a quiet life of books, maps, and stories by the fireplace. Years passed like warm summer breezes, and no one suspected that the greatest shadow in history now lay inside a hobbit's pocket. But the ring had begun to tighten its hold. Bilbo felt it lengthen his life, sharpen his possessiveness, and coil around his thoughts. He called it my precious, without ever knowing why. And as the weight of it grew, a mentor stepped forward. Gandalf the Grey, wise and watchful, sensing the faint tremor of something ancient. I remember the way he studied Bilbo, the way he waited for the truth to unveil itself. He did not force the answer. He let time speak. And time did. Finally, on Bilbo's Eleventi first birthday, the ring made its move. In a moment of unusual irritation, Bilbo slipped it upon his finger and vanished before the eyes of all who loved him. I can still imagine the gasps, the confusion, the way Gandalf's expression shifted from suspicion to certainty. That night, in the quiet of Bag End, he confronted Bilbo, urging him to let the ring go. And Bilbo, trembling between attachment and freedom, finally placed it on the floor before leaving the Shire forever. You must realize how extraordinary that moment was. Few beings in all of history have willingly surrendered the ring. His choice saved more than he could ever know. And so the ring waited again, glinting faintly on the tiles, until Frodo Baggins picked it up. Frodo did not yet understand the burden he had inherited. When I think of him holding the ring with such innocence, I feel a pang of both admiration and sorrow. He believed it was merely a keepsake, a curious relic from his uncle's adventures. But Gandalf's fears deepened, and when the inscriptions of the Black Speech revealed themselves in flame, the truth could no longer be denied. The ring had found a new bearer, and this time, its influence would stretch far beyond a hobbit hole in the Shire. Frodo was chosen not because he sought greatness, but because he never desired power at all. And that, I want you to hear clearly, is what made him dangerous to the ring and precious to the fate of Middle-earth. When I tell you about the day Frodo left the Shire, I want you to imagine the quiet weight of a place that has never known war, never tasted fear, and never expected greatness from anyone within its borders. The Shire was gentle, almost timeless, wrapped in green hills and peaceful laughter. And yet, in that gentleness, a storm had already begun to gather. I remember watching Frodo as he held the ring, not with hunger or pride, but with a quiet unease, as though he sensed the balance of his life shifting beneath him. Gandalf had laid the truth before him, stark and undeniable. If the ring stayed, darkness would come for all he loved. And so Frodo did what few could. He prepared to leave everything behind. His departure was not a heroic march, but a hesitant step into the unknown. He tried to slip away quietly, believing solitude was the safest choice. Yet the Shire has a way of refusing to let its own wander alone. Samwise Gamgee, steadfast and stubborn in the best way, was caught eavesdropping outside the window, and rather than scold him, Gandalf bound his loyalty with purpose. I remember the way Sam trembled, not from fear of the journey, but from the possibility of failing Frodo. And soon after, Merry and Pippin stumbled into their path, not by destiny's design, but by sheer mischief and curiosity. Somehow, this unlikely collection of hobbits formed the first small circle of companionship around the ring-bearer, long before they knew what dangers lay beyond the familiar borders of home. I want you to feel the tension of those early days, when the world still seemed safe even as shadows lengthened at its edges. The four hobbits traveled across fields and forests, laughing at times, whispering at others, but always trying to outrun a fear they could not name. Then came the first true sign that the ring had awakened forces far beyond their imagining, the arrival of the Black Riders. Cloaked figures on dark horses, gliding as though the earth itself recoiled beneath them. Whenever they drew near, a chill crept into the air, and the very grass seemed to quiver. Frodo felt the ring tug at him, beckoning him to slip it onto his finger, to surrender to something ancient and malevolent. Yet every time, Sam's voice, Merry's hand, Pippin's gasp pulled him back from that fatal brink. Reaching Bree felt like stepping into another world. The hobbits had expected safety, perhaps even the arrival of Gandalf. Instead, they found only unease. Eyes watched them too closely. Whispers followed their steps. And in that crowded inn called the Prancing Pony, an accident nearly shattered everything. Frodo, trying to silence Pippin's loose tongue, slipped and the ring fell upon his finger. In an instant, he vanished, and with his disappearance, a cry echoed across the unseen world. I can still imagine the way the ringwraiths must have felt it, like a beacon flaring against the night sky. But fate, or perhaps something gentler, intervened. A tall, weathered ranger stepped forward from the shadows. Strider, a man who carried both weariness and destiny in the set of his shoulders. Strider revealed little about himself that night, yet I sensed, as you surely would, that his silence held more truth than any boastful tale. He warned them of danger, spoke of the riders with a grim certainty that came only from surviving them, and offered his protection. Trust did not come easily, yet the hobbits had no better choice. With Gandalf missing, they followed Strider into the wild, every step carrying them farther from the world they knew and deeper into the path laid by the ring. But even the most capable guides cannot shield the heart entirely. On the hill of Weathertop, under a night trembling with tension, the riders struck. Frodo, overwhelmed by fear and the lure of invisibility, slipped the ring onto his finger, and the world shifted into shadow. A Morgul blade pierced him, a wound meant not only to kill, but to claim his soul for darkness. In that moment, as the riders closed in, salvation came from an unexpected light. Arwen, the elven princess of Rivendell, rode with a grace that seemed to outrun the wind itself. She lifted Frodo onto her horse and raced toward her homeland, the riders following like a storm of black wings. I can still feel the breathlessness of that chase, the river surging behind her as she called upon ancient power to sweep the enemies away. Frodo slipped into unconsciousness, his life hanging by a thread as he crossed the threshold of Rivendell. There, under the watchful eyes of Elrond, he drifted between life and death until the shard of that cursed blade was drawn from his wound. When Frodo awoke, surrounded by friends who had feared they would lose him, a new chapter began not just for him, but for every free people of Middle-earth. Gandalf had returned, burdened with revelations of betrayal and rising darkness. Elves, dwarves, and men gathered for a council that would decide the fate of the ring. I remember the tension in the air, voices clashing like swords, each race arguing over who should wield the power or destroy it. But the truth was painfully simple. None who desired the ring could be trusted with it, and so it fell to Frodo, quiet and small, to stand and declare the words that would alter every destiny in that hall. He would take the ring to Mount Doom. He believed he would walk alone. But that, my friend, is never how true courage unfolds. Sam stepped forward first, declaring he would not let Frodo out of his sight. Then Merry and Pippin, hearts larger than their fears. Gandalf joined them with sober resolve, Aragorn with noble purpose, Legolas with elven grace, Gimli with dwarven pride, and Boromir with a complicated devotion to his kingdom. 9 companions, bound not by power but by shared purpose, stood together. And in that unity, the Fellowship of the Ring was born. When I lead you into the dark halls of Moria, I want you to understand the weight that pressed upon us long before we crossed its threshold. The Fellowship had set out with a clear purpose, yet every step after Rivendell tightened the coil of danger around us. Snowstorms blocked the mountain pass, wolves prowled in the night, and the lingering sense that something unseen watched us never fully vanished. When the path over Caradhras failed, Gandalf turned his gaze toward the ancient dwarven kingdom beneath the mountains. Even then, I felt a chill, for the very ground seemed to whisper warnings. But choices narrowed quickly, and with enemies closing in behind us, we descended into a place that no longer welcomed the living. The doors of Moria opened only after Gandalf recalled a forgotten riddle, and the moment we stepped inside, the world changed. Darkness swallowed the light with a hunger that felt almost alive. Our footsteps echoed through vast, hollow chambers, where once hammers rang with pride and laughter. I remember the sorrow etched across Gimli's face as he realized this was no longer the thriving heart of his people but a tomb. Not long after, we found proof bodies, silent halls, the remnants of a final stand etched in broken weapons and stone. What struck me most was not the violence itself, but how long it must have gone unseen, sealed away from the rest of the world, as though grief had turned to stone and waited for us to witness it. Moments later, Pippin's curiosity awakened a terror none of us wished to meet. His small hand dislodged a skeleton into a deep well, and the sound rang through the cavern like a summons. We held our breaths, hoping the silence would return, but instead, distant drums began to thunder. It was a sound that carved fear directly into the bone. Orcs swarmed the corridors, grotesque and relentless, and with them came a cave troll, its massive arms smashing through the stone as it forced its way toward us. Frodo, smaller than any blade around him, found himself the target of the creature's fury. When its spear struck him, we believed him lost. But beneath his clothing lay the mithril coat, shining proof of Bilbo's love and foresight. Saved for the moment, we fled deeper into the dark. Our escape brought us to the bridge of Khazad-dûm, where suspense tightened so sharply that even the air felt brittle. It was here that we encountered a foe born of fire and ancient wrath, the Balrog. A towering shadow wreathed in flame, it strode toward us with a presence so overwhelming that the very stones trembled beneath its steps. Gandalf faced it with a steady resolve that shook me more than the creature itself. He stood upon the narrow bridge, staff and sword in hand, meeting the Balrog's fury with the quiet certainty of one who understands sacrifice. His words, simple, defiant, still echo in my memory. "You cannot pass." The bridge cracked, the Balrog fell, and for a heartbeat we believed victory was ours. But as the monster plunged into the abyss, its whip curled upward, catching Gandalf and pulling him into the depths. His final words shattered us. "Fly, you fools. Grief is a weight unlike any other, and I felt it dragging at my heels as we stumbled out of Moria into the blinding daylight. Without Gandalf's guidance, the Fellowship seemed suddenly smaller, more fragile, as though the world itself had tilted away from us. Aragorn took the lead, not because he sought it, but because duty demanded it. He urged us toward Lothlorien, the golden wood of the elves, where he hoped we might find rest or at least a moment to breathe. The forest embraced us in light that shimmered like captured starlight. Time felt different there, softer, as though the trees wove their own gentle shield around our wounded spirits. Yet even in such peace, the weight of our loss clung to us like a shadow that would not lift. Galadriel received us with a grace that felt almost beyond mortal comprehension. When she looked upon each of us, it was as if she pierced through every defense we carried and saw directly into the quiet truths we tried to hide. Her pool of water revealed visions, not certainties, but possibilities stretched thin between hope and despair. Frodo stood before her, the ring heavy in his grasp, and for a moment even she, ancient and wise, felt its pull. Yet she resisted, shining brighter than the shadow that reached for her. That act alone reminded me that even in the direst moments, light does not vanish, it wavers, but it endures. She gave us gifts suited to our paths, though we did not yet understand their purpose. And with that, the Fellowship set out once more. As we drifted down the river, the world around us began to shift. Arguments sharpened, silence thickened, and the burden upon Frodo grew almost unbearable. The ring sensed its danger. It pushed against Frodo's will, whispering through every weakness. Boromir, noble yet troubled, felt its lure most intensely. His eyes lingered too long, his voice trembled with unspoken longing, and though he fought against it, I could feel the tension tightening around him like a rope. At Amon Hen, the breaking point arrived. He tried to take the ring from Frodo, not out of greed, but out of desperation to save his people. Yet intention does not soften corruption. Frodo fled, shaken to the core, realizing that the Fellowship was no longer a sanctuary but a liability. And so, in that quiet heartbreak, the Fellowship shattered. Frodo chose to continue alone, believing solitude would spare his friends from danger. But Sam, fierce in loyalty, refused to let him vanish into the shadows. They set off together toward Mordor, while the others scattered into their own battles, some for rescue, some for redemption. As I look back and tell this to you, I see that the breaking of the Fellowship was not an ending but a transformation. Each path that emerged from that moment would shape the fate of Middle-earth in ways none of us could yet see. When the Fellowship broke, the world seemed to split along with it, and I want you to feel that fracture as clearly as I did. Frodo and Sam moved into the shadows of Mordor, while the rest of us found ourselves standing at the edge of a battlefield that had not yet begun. Two paths stretched before us, neither chosen willingly, but both essential to the fate that awaited Middle-earth. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli rushed through the forest, in pursuit of the captors who had taken Merry and Pippin, driven not only by duty but by a sense of guilt, as though losing the hobbits meant losing a piece of the Fellowship's soul. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam followed Gollum into the unknown, trusting a creature torn between loyalty and madness. In that moment, I realized that courage does not always march in one direction. It divides itself, adapting to the needs of a world on the brink of war. As Aragorn led the chase across the open plains of Rohan, the landscape itself felt like a warning. The grass was trampled, villages abandoned, and the wind carried whispers of a kingdom buckling under pressure. When they finally encountered the riders of Rohan, led by Éomer, suspicion hung thick in the air. The riders believed the hobbits were already dead, casualties of a brutal skirmish with orc raiders. Yet Aragorn refused to yield to despair. His certainty that the hobbits still lived pushed them deeper into Rohan's troubled heart. At the same time, Frodo and Sam followed Gollum through treacherous swamps where corpses of ancient battles shimmered beneath the water. I remember how Gollum's voice shifted like a cracked mirror, sometimes pleading, sometimes cunning, never allowing us to forget that he served two masters, Frodo's kindness and the ring's call. The war began not with a single clash of swords, but with small fractures spreading like cracks across stone. Gondor sent no riders to Rohan, and Rohan sent no aid in return. Saruman, hidden behind iron and flame, spread poison with words as easily as he did with armies. King Theoden, once proud, had become a husk of himself under the influence of a voice that coiled around his thoughts like smoke. Wormtongue, slithering with false counsel, whispered fear into his ears until even the very walls of his hall felt dim and hollow. When Aragorn and his companions arrived in Edoras, I could almost feel the tension tightening, as though the room itself waited for truth to shatter the illusion. Gandalf's return as the White Wizard tore through the corruption like sunlight breaking storm clouds, freeing Théoden from the chains of manipulation. But liberation brought no comfort, for war was already marching toward them. Saruman's forces gathered in the tens of thousands, designed for one purpose: to crush Rohan completely. As Théoden chose to lead his people toward Helm's Deep, hoping its ancient walls would provide refuge, Aragorn sensed the danger tightening around them. This was not a battle of survival alone, but a test of the alliances that had long held Middle-earth together. What struck me most during this time was how every choice felt weighted not with fear, but with the burden of history pressing down on those who dared stand against the rising darkness. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam reached the Black Gate, only to discover it was fortified beyond hope. Despair might have consumed them had Gollum not revealed another path, one secret and far more perilous. That revelation marked a turning point. Gollum, torn between devotion and resentment, began to show signs of genuine loyalty toward Frodo, or at least the fragile outline of it. Sam, ever protective, trusted none of it, and I cannot blame him. The path ahead demanded more than courage. It demanded the ability to see through deception without letting suspicion blind the heart. While the hobbits ventured deeper into territories long abandoned by hope, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli continued their pursuit until they stumbled into Fangorn Forest, a place older than memory. There they encountered Gandalf once more, reborn, stronger, and clearer in purpose. His return stitched together a thread of hope that had been fraying since Moria. From that moment, the two paths, though separate, began to shape the war together. Merry and Pippin found themselves in the company of Treebeard and the Ents, ancient shepherds of the forest whose strength lay not in haste but in patience. Their awakening would prove pivotal. Aragorn joined Gandalf to rally Rohan's scattered defenses, preparing for the storm gathering at Helm's Deep. And Frodo, stepping deeper into the grasp of the ring, leaned heavily on Sam and Gollum as they moved toward the realm of Gondor's forgotten borders. The threads of destiny tightened around all of them, not in unison, but in harmony, each action influencing the next, like ripples across a vast lake. This is why I call this chapter the beginning of the war, not because armies clashed yet, but because hearts had already chosen their sides. Rohan would stand and fight. Gondor would brace for a darkness it could no longer ignore. The Ents, stirred by the hobbits' pleas, leaned toward vengeance against Saruman, and Frodo, though fragile, carried the weight of a burden heavier than any blade. Looking back, I realize that war does not begin with the striking of steel, but with the quiet determination of those who refuse to yield. It begins in council halls, in whispered doubts, in small acts of courage that ripple outward until the world has no choice but to change. So as I share this with you, understand that these divided paths were not signs of weakness. They were the foundation of the resistance itself. While some gathered armies, others carried hope. While some prepared walls for siege, others slipped through shadows to prevent destruction before it could spread. Two paths, destined to converge again, forged the first sparks of the war that would decide the fate of all Middle-earth. And from those sparks, the fire of destiny began to rise. When I speak to you about Helm's Deep, I want you to feel the tremor that ran through the very soil before the first sword was drawn. There are battles where armies clash for land or pride, but this one was different. It was a stand against extinction, a final refuge for a people hunted by an enemy forged in iron and malice. As Rohan's riders and villagers poured into the fortress, I saw a mixture of fear and stubborn resolve in their eyes. Théoden tried to wear the crown of courage, yet every line on his face betrayed the fear that he might be the last king of a dying people. Even Aragorn sensed the weight of what was coming, though he hid his dread beneath a mantle of leadership. Night had not yet fallen, but the air already felt like a held breath, as though the world itself waited to see who would endure. Inside those ancient stone walls, the atmosphere tightened like the string of a bow. Children sharpened blades too heavy for their hands. Old men donned armor that no longer fit. Mothers whispered courage into trembling hearts. I walked among them, feeling the truth settle bitterly within me. We were preparing not for a simple battle, but for a siege meant to erase Rohan entirely. When the rain began to fall, it came not as relief, but as omen. Lightning illuminated the valley for brief moments, revealing an approaching darkness that moved with unnatural precision. Saruman's army legions of Uruk-hai, bred solely for war, advanced in a black wave. The ground quivered beneath their synchronized march. Their torches flickered like the eyes of predators closing in. And in that moment, Helm's Deep was no longer a fortress. It was a test of whether hope could survive when surrounded by overwhelming despair. The first horn blast shattered the silence, and the siege erupted. Arrows rained from the walls, slicing into the enemy ranks, yet they kept coming with relentless purpose. Ladders crashed against the battlements, shields locked in grim resolve, and the Uruk-hai climbed as though driven by a hunger deeper than life. I remember seeing Aragorn move through the chaos like a flame through darkness, calm, decisive, fierce. Beside him, Legolas unleashed volleys of arrows that blurred into silver streaks. Gimli's axe rose and fell with thunderous rhythm, each strike accompanied by muttered challenges and triumphant shouts. Yet even with their brilliance, the tide did not break. Saruman's monstrous creations fought without fear or fatigue, and when a single spark from his explosives ruptured the deeping wall, the fortress shook as though struck by lightning. Water and stone burst outward, throwing soldiers from their posts as the enemy surged through the breach. Helm's Deep dissolved into chaos. Battle roared through every corridor, every courtyard. Theoden's face hardened into a mask of defiance as he ordered his men to fall back to the keep. Aragorn tried to rally the soldiers, but exhaustion weighed heavily on all of us. The enemy seemed infinite, each slain foe replaced by two more pushing through the shattered defenses. For a moment, a brief, terrible moment, I believed the night would end in silence, the kind that follows annihilation. But Aragorn, refusing to surrender to despair, remembered Gandalf's promise. To look to the dawn, with a spark of wild hope, he urged Theoden to ride out. Together they burst through the gates, charging directly into the sea of enemies with the desperation of those who know honor is all that remains. Their bravery carved a brief path through the darkness, though it was clear that even valor might not be enough. Then the world shifted. The first light of morning crept over the ridge, illuminating a figure upon the hill, Gandalf the White, radiant against the gold of dawn. And beside him, Éomer and the riders of Rohan descended like a torrent of justice. The clash that followed felt like the world exhaling after a long night of suffocation. The Uruk-hai, unprepared for a cavalry strike from above, faltered. The combined force of hope and steel broke their formation, scattering them into the trees below. Victory, so fragile only moments earlier, now burst forth like sunlight, driving away the last shades of night. Helm's Deep had survived, but war, as you and I both know, rarely grants triumph without cost. While the battle raged in Rohan, another storm gathered in the deep silence of Fangorn Forest. Merry and Pippin, carried far from their companions, found themselves before Treebeard and the Ents, the oldest shepherds of Middle-earth. They were beings of patience, deliberate in thought and action, and at first, they refused to join the war. Their hearts leaned toward preservation rather than confrontation. But when Pippin led Treebeard to the edge of Isengard, and he saw the devastation Saruman had carved into the forest, something ancient awakened within him. Raged not the fire-hot fury of men, but the deep, tectonic wrath of nature itself rose from roots older than kingdoms. The Ents convened, and their decision was not simply to fight, but to cleanse. Their march was unlike any battle cry I had ever known. It was slow, monumental, unstoppable, the earth itself moving to reclaim what had been wounded. They struck Isengard with a power that made its stone towers tremble. Saruman's machines, so confident in their precision, were no match for the raw force of living wood and ancient strength. Water roared through the ruins as the Ents shattered dams and flooded the pits, drowning the fires that had consumed their kin. Isengard fell not to swords or spells, but to vengeance so old it felt like justice written by the natural world itself. In the wake of their charge, Saruman's fortress lay crippled, stripped of its voice and authority. So as I recount these twin battles to you, the night of terror at Helm's Deep and the righteous fury of the Ents, I see how fate wove strength from struggle. Rohan endured because courage refused to yield, and the forest rose because grief transformed into action. These victories were not the end, but the beginning of a larger struggle that would test every corner of Middle-earth. Yet, for the first time in a long while, hope gained a foothold. And hope, once ignited, can burn brighter than any shadow. When I guide you into the siege of Gondor, I want you to feel the shadow that gathered long before the first arrow flew. Minas Tirith, the White City, towered with the dignity of ages past, yet even its gleaming walls could not hide the tremor of fear that ran through its people. I remember standing upon its high terraces, watching the fields of Pelennor stretch outward like a quiet prayer to the horizon. But beyond that horizon, the darkness thickened. Sauron had turned his full gaze upon the world of men, and the air itself grew heavy with omen. Denethor, steward of Gondor, seemed consumed by a grief he could not shake, pacing his halls like a man already mourning the death of his kingdom. I felt then that the true siege had begun long before the armies arrived. It began in the hearts of those waiting for doom. News of the coming onslaught reached us by dawn. Osgiliath had fallen. The river crossings, once Gondor's first line of defense, were overrun. Faramir returned battered and ghost-pale, carrying with him the weight of his father's disappointment. I could almost hear Denethor's spirit cracking when he looked upon his wounded son, not with compassion, but with despair twisted into accusation. And as the day bled into evening, the first drums began to echo from beyond the walls. Mordor's legions poured forth in terrible numbers, towers of iron, monstrous beasts, and soldiers whose armor seemed forged from the night itself. Their march shook the very stones. For a moment, I wondered whether Minas Tirith, proud and noble, could withstand such fury. But I also knew that in war, the strength of a city is measured not by its walls, but by the courage of those who stand upon them. The assault began with a silence far more terrifying than any roar. Then, without warning, boulders launched from siege engines crashed against the city's outer ring, shattering stone and sending dust spiraling through the streets. Screams rose from every level of the city. The Witch King of Angmar, Sauron's most dreadful servant, descended upon the battlefield with a presence so chilling that even the bravest soldiers faltered beneath his shadow. I watched as his mount, a great winged horror, circled the sky like a vulture eager for a feast. Denethor, lost to despair, abandoned his duty, leaving Gandalf to command the defense. And Gandalf, with a calm carved from centuries, became the steady flame resisting a storm. He rode through the streets like a lone beacon of purpose, urging men to hold the walls, to remember the blood of kings that flowed in Gondor's veins. But even the brightest hope bends under relentless force. The gates of Minas Tirith, thick as mountainsides, trembled beneath the blows of Grond, the battering ram forged in mockery of ancient power. With each strike, the gate splintered, and the torchlight revealed cracks spreading like veins of doom. When it finally burst open, a wave of darkness surged inside. The Witch King entered with an aura that seemed to suffocate the air. For a heartbeat, Gondor held its breath. I saw Gandalf raise his staff as though preparing for a final stand, but the clash never came, for destiny had something else in store. The horns of Rohan echoed across the battlefield not faintly, but as a clarion cry rising from the Pelennor fields. Hope arrived not as a whisper, but as a thunder. The riders of Rohan swept across the plain like a tide of living fire. Theoden rode at their head, a king reborn, his voice carrying certainty powerful enough to drown out the despair of minutes before. Their charge crashed into the enemy ranks with earth-shaking force. I remember watching the sunlight catch the tips of their spears, scattering light across the battlefield like shards of dawn. Yet victory in war is never simple. The Haradrim arrived with their colossal warbeast creatures so massive that the ground seemed to recoil beneath them. Still, the Rohirrim fought with a fury sharpened by sacrifice. Even as Theoden met his end beneath the fell creature's shadow, his riders carried his strength forward. The battle shifted, wild and unpredictable, with every victory tempered by loss. And then, when the tide threatened to tilt once more toward despair, the sea itself seemed to open. Ships bearing black sails approached the riverbank, striking fear into Gondor's defenders. But the illusion shattered when Aragorn leapt ashore, not as a ranger cloaked in anonymity, but as the rightful king, bearing Andúril and the army of the dead at his back. The spectral warriors swept through the battlefield with a force beyond mortal strength, turning Mordor's hosts into a tide collapsing under its own weight. In mere moments, the impossible became inevitable. The enemy faltered, the siege broke, and Minas Tirith, scarred but unbowed, stood bathed in the light of hard-won hope. But victory, my friend, was not enough. Sauron's eye burned brighter than ever, searching for the ring, sensing the trap closing around him. Aragorn understood the truth before any of us. Gondor could not win by strength alone. The only way to give Frodo and Sam a chance was to confront Sauron directly, to draw his gaze away from the mountain path they climbed. And so, the final gambit took shape. The remnants of our armies, weary and wounded, marched toward the Black Gate, not to conquer, but to deceive. As we stood before that monstrous portal, surrounded by enemies beyond count, I felt a strange calm. We were not there to win. We were there to buy hope. And hope in the hands of two hobbits far beyond our sight was worth every risk we faced. So when I look back upon the siege of Gondor and the courage demanded by that final march, I see the essence of what it means to resist darkness. Gondor withstood fire, fear, and despair, not because its soldiers were flawless, but because they stood even when standing felt impossible. And our last advance toward the Black Gate, small in number, vast in purpose, was proof that true victory is often built on acts that appear hopeless. The final gambit was more than strategy. It was a declaration that even in the face of overwhelming shadow, the will to protect what we love can shine brighter than any flame. And that flame, fragile though it was, became the guiding light for the world's last hope. When I speak to you about the final climb toward Mount Doom, I want you to feel the exhaustion that clung to every breath Frodo and Sam drew. The world around them had turned into a wasteland of ash and shadow, a place where even hope seemed to dissolve in the heat rising from the mountain's veins. Their bodies trembled, their lips cracked, and their feet dragged through dust that felt older than time itself. And yet, step by agonizing step, they moved forward. The sky above them swirled with a darkness that pulsed like a living wound, for Sauron's gaze was fixed fully upon the armies marching toward the Black Gate. It was in that narrow window of distraction that the two hobbits, so small against the vastness of evil, pressed on toward the one place where the fate of the world would be decided. By this time, the ring had grown unbearably heavy. I remember how Frodo's hand shook whenever he touched it, as if the metal itself burned with a hunger that wanted to consume him from the inside out. Sam, ever steadfast, bore the weight of both their spirits when Frodo could no longer carry his own. There came a moment when Frodo collapsed entirely, his strength spent, his voice barely a whisper, and Sam, in an act of devotion that still stirs me deeply, lifted him onto his back. "I can't carry it for you," he said, "but I can carry you." Those words, quiet yet filled with an unbreakable will, became the final push that kept them moving toward the mountain's throat. It was not power that carried them, it was loyalty, love, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. But the ring, sensing the danger of its own destruction, called out to its last and most tormented servant. Gollum returned like a shadow that refused to be scattered. His eyes gleamed with a madness, sharpened by centuries of obsession. As Frodo and Sam reached the jagged path leading into the heart of Mount Doom, Gollum attacked with a desperation that bordered on tragic. Steel and stone clashed beneath their feet as the three figures struggled, each driven by forces greater than themselves. Sam fought with fury born from love, but Frodo, fragile and trembling, found himself pulled into a battle between mercy and possession. And when he finally reached the crack of doom, the exact place where the ring had been forged, the final test awaited him. I want you to understand what happened next, not as weakness, but as the inevitable culmination of the ring's design. Frodo, having borne its weight farther than anyone before him, looked into the fire and chose it for himself. He slipped the ring onto his finger, vanishing into the unseen realm, claiming the very power he had sworn to destroy. It was a moment as heartbreaking as it was human. But destiny, ever unpredictable, intervened through Gollum. Driven by obsession, he leaped upon the invisible Frodo, wrestling blindly until he clutched the ring at last. In his triumph, he danced dangerously on the edge of the abyss, and in one terrible instant, Gollum slipped, falling into the fire below, the ring clasped tightly in his hands. The lava swallowed both master and servant, ending a tragedy centuries in the making. When the ring melted, the world shuddered. Mount Doom erupted with a fury that seemed to tear the sky apart. Sauron's tower cracked from its foundations, his spirit unraveling like smoke ripped apart by the wind. The Nazgûl shrieked as they burned away into nothingness. On the battlefield before the Black Gate, the armies of Mordor collapsed, their purpose severed. And amid the chaos, Frodo and Sam clung to the rocky slope, surrounded by fire and ruin. For a moment, it appeared they would perish alongside the evil they had unmade. Yet hope does not abandon those who give everything. The eagles, summoned by Gandalf, swept down through the smoke, bearing the two hobbits away from the dying mountain as it roared behind them. When Frodo awoke in Minas Tirith, sunlight streamed through the open window, gentle, warm, sincere. It was as if the world itself was breathing again. One by one, his friends entered the room, their faces alight with relief and joy. Never had laughter sounded sweeter. The coronation of Aragorn soon followed, marking the rebirth of the kingdom of men. I stood among the crowd as he stepped forward, no longer the wandering ranger but the rightful king, radiant with purpose. Beside him, Arwen walked with grace like moonlight given form. Their union symbolized not only love but the healing of a world long fractured by war. Yet even in triumph, the story did not end with celebration. Returning to the Shire should have felt like stepping back into peace. But Frodo carried wounds no medicine could mend. The weight of his burden lingered like a shadow behind his eyes. While Sam, Merry, and Pippin reclaimed the rhythms of home, Frodo moved through the Shire as though caught between two worlds. In time, he understood that some scars reach deeper than flesh, that healing sometimes means accepting that peace may lie elsewhere. And so, when the final ship prepared to leave Middle-earth, Frodo joined Gandalf, Bilbo, and the elves on their journey to the Undying Lands. As Frodo sailed westward, the light of the setting sun kissed the waves, casting gold across the water like the last blessing of an age now complete. Sam watched him disappear beyond the horizon, sorrow and gratitude mingling in his heart. Then he returned home to family, to warmth, to the life Frodo had fought so desperately to protect. And so the story, vast and filled with shadows, found its final quiet note, not in triumph or despair, but in the simple truth that even the smallest hands can shape the destiny of the world. That, I tell you now, is the legacy left behind the echo of courage that never fades. As I close this tale I have shared with you, I find myself lingering on the truth that makes The Lord of the Rings endure far beyond the final page. It is not simply a story of kingdoms, battles, or ancient powers. It is a story of hearts, of the quiet bravery inside those who never sought greatness, of the unyielding hope that flickers even when the world teeters on the edge of darkness. It reminds me, and perhaps now it reminds you as well, that courage is often found in unexpected places, carried by unexpected hands. There is a rare magic in a story that can make us hold our breath, ache for distant worlds, and see ourselves reflected in characters far smaller or far mightier than we are. This tale does exactly that. It whispers to us about loyalty, sacrifice, friendship, and the cost of choosing what is right when the easier path lies wide open. And as I tell it to you now, I can't help but admire the depth, the artistry, and the quiet thunder that lives in every corner of this epic. If this journey has moved you even a little, then I invite you to share your thoughts. Tell me which moment struck you deepest, which character stayed with you long after the telling, or what part of this vast world you would venture into if you had the chance. Your voice matters here, because stories like this are meant to be felt, discussed, and cherished together. So go ahead, leave your reflection, your favorite moment, or simply your feeling after walking through Middle-earth with me. I'm listening.